Hello. In this episode, we evaluate together the key pillars of what is known as Darwin's theory of evolution. Charles Darwin is an English researcher in natural history. Now, he mentioned many observations collected during his travels and reported from others, such as morphological similarity and sharing, among different species of creatures and their geographical distribution patterns. And built on the assumption that all living beings came from a common ancestor that underwent processes of evolution and migration. So the object undergoes slight cumulative changes, then nature takes its course. For the beneficial changes are preserved by nature, resulting in a new species. Over thousands and millions of years, whereas nature, according to Darwin, reduced their numbers, countless transitional beings have undergone harmful or non-beneficial changes. In addition to the role of screening, Darwin assumed that nature contributed to creating new traits in beings. So when an animal acquires certain traits due to its environment, it passes these traits to its offspring. This agrees with Lamarck's assumption that a giraffe with an exceptionally long neck, once upon a time there was a short leash. But with the changing natural circumstances around it, and having to extend its neck to eat from the top of the tree, its neck kept getting longer generation after generation, until it became what it is today. What's most important is that Darwin assumed that living beings resulted from these changes by a total coincidence, meaning without intention, unintentionally, and in his words, there was no plan for creation. This created a lot of variety in species, which he confirmed in many places. From writing, Darwin published these ideas in 1859 in a book titled On the Origin of Species. Then he wanted to provide a detailed mechanism for the inheritance of acquired traits, publishing his hypothesis called pangenesis in his book, The Origin of Species, some years later, which assumed that when nature affects an organism's cells, these somatic cells secrete small substances, which Darwin named gemmules, which concentrated in the organism's reproductive organs to be passed on to its offspring. And where does the common ancestor come from, Darwin? Where did the first being, on which you built your ideas and attributed all living beings to, come from? Darwin did not specify in his book, but he stipulated in various correspondences. With the world of plants, Joseph Dalton Hooker agreed that his view was that the first organism emerged in a warm pond, with factors like light, heat, and electricity. Darwin thus agreed with the idea of spontaneous generation that was popular in his era, where it was believed that living beings could spontaneously form from non-living matter. So, for example, it was thought that insects originated from food remains. It was believed that fly larvae emerged from rotten pieces of meat. In summary, these are the pillars of Darwin's theory of evolution. A living being somehow generated from inanimate objects. Nature grants new traits to beings that could transform them from one species to another. Acquired traits are inherited. Nature selects cumulatively, leading to higher beings, thus forming complex biological systems from simple successive changes. And the conclusion is that living organisms evolved over time, unintentionally and without the will of a deliberate actor who knows what he is doing. On this table, Darwin loaded every living creature in the universe. And now, what is the overall assessment of the pillars upon which Darwin built this result? As for the spontaneous generation of living beings from non-living matter, it's a myth debunked by experiments, the most famous being that of Francesco Redi, 2 centuries before Darwin. Louis Pasteur's experiment, published 5 years after Darwin's book, he proved that the beings thought to spontaneously generate from non-living matter, like food leftovers. It came not from within the nutrients, but from the polluted air with them. And to Pasteur, this is attributed the pasteurization process and pasteurized milk. And the truth is, spontaneous generation is fundamentally illogical. To imagine a living being spontaneously arising from non-living matter. And yet they insisted on trying, they tried. You try, and the myth falls through empirical science and reason. And as for nature creating new traits in a being through use and neglect, like the giraffe's neck, for example, a myth also fell with the discoveries of Gregor Mendel, which years after Darwin proved that the hereditary traits of the children, however numerous, nothing will change from what originally exists in the parents. And it fell with the discoveries of epigenetics, which showed that external and environmental factors, it is possible to change the way genetic material is read in a being to activate a dormant trait, or extinguishing a trait that was active, but it does not add genetic material that was not added before. They are already present. As for the inheritance of acquired characteristics, it's a myth debunked by simple observation. For example, the muscles of a blacksmith and a carpenter, which they acquired in their lives, don't allow for such observation. Inheritance does not pass on to the children, no. Yet, Darwin's followers insisted on experimenting, putting it to the test. Weizmann kept cutting the tails of 19 generations of mice, only for the poor man to be surprised after all his teaching. With each birth of her children, new tails are born again. It means that the acquired trait, the cut tail, did not transfer to the offspring. So what's left of Darwin's theory then? You'll say natural selection is true. I tell you, the right amount of it is neither Darwin's invention nor a figment of his imagination. Everyone knows that the weaker animal will find it difficult to adapt to harsh environmental conditions. But a natural selection by Darwin surpassed it. And that also means creating complex biological systems from simple consecutive random changes. To understand what natural selection means to you, Darwin's vast imagination led him to the idea that nature, use, and neglect. For ancient beings, it produced simple bodily structures that could serve the creature in some way. So natural selection kept it, which did not know that the accumulation of these structures, it will produce a complete integral member, like a wing for a bird or an eye for an animal. Now, to grasp Darwin's logic in this, imagine a land filled with junk, traversed by countless blind beings. And each of them picks up a random piece of scrap, then enters into a large building, which closes its door after every entrant. Millions of years passed, and the blind picked up scraps and died to be buried under the building's ground. Or one day you open the gate of the building, and a giant Boeing plane, piloted by a blind person, burst through the gate and soared into the sky. You wondered, how did the blind man manage to make an airplane? It was said he didn't intend to make it. Rather, it's what happened with the blind before him. Whoever among them picked up a useful piece of junk endured and passed it on to their offspring. Some of them picked up a cloth to shield themselves from the cold. Another picked up a metal sheet to shelter from the sun. And a third picked up from the scrap a plain steering wheel to stir his food while cooking. And the fourth picked up a bottle, made it his shield in his fight against his enemies from worship. Those came over successive periods, inheriting their sector to successors, assembling unintentionally, without deliberate action, until it formed this great plane you see. Beware of imagining that anyone intended for a plane to form or to fly. By the same logic, Darwin considered that natural selection patched up the structures of living beings over time. For example, bird wings helping the bird to fly are pseudo-purpose, meaning a fictitious goal and not real. The eyesight is an imaginary target. There is no intentional doer choosing the eye to see or the fire to flicker. All this came with the accumulations of echo in the blind. This is Darwin's joke of blind natural selection he presented to us. And it, in addition to its silliness to every sound mind. Scientific discoveries have proven its impossibility with the existence of irreducible complexity, or what's known as irreducible complexity, in every detail of beings and their relationships, meaning that the structures and organs of living beings are extremely complex and integrated. It could only exist if all its parts were available at the same time, otherwise not. It will not perform its function, and thus it is not compatible with the idea of gradual formation at all, even at the level of the smallest living unit, the cell, which Darwin could not see under his microscope in his days except as a simple blot. So natural selection, as Darwin depicted, is also mythical. On such irrational myths, both logically and experimentally, Darwin based the most foolish and stupid idea in history, that all the precision and perfection we see in this creation supposedly came by chance. Nor do they need knowledge or wisdom. So what remains of Darwin's theory then? Only his fantasies that almost seem like a contribution to a contest titled or Saudi. Scientists in fantasy compete to make the audience laugh. His imagination, akin to bedtime stories, lingered. About the frog prince, the swan princess, and Cinderella's mice who turned into beautiful coaches, but with one addition, this indeed requires a very long time. Imagination that puts feathers on dinosaurs as they chase mosquitoes to fly, and the imagination that jumped to Darwin's mind about the black bear spending hours in water, opening wide to get as many insects in as possible, so they said. With the whale that opens its mouth for fish to enter, and as long as there's a resemblance, it seems that the whale has evolved in Darwin's logic, as in the fax copy of the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, page 184. Someone might say, but what about Darwin's science? What about the numerous observations he collected in his book, and about the accuracy of his note-taking? Darwin was somewhat like a program. It has many inputs, but the equation that links these inputs is wrong, resulting in an incorrect outcome. So Darwin's wealth of information and vast reading did not help him. It's very important, brothers, to understand that observing birds, reptiles, insects, and others isn't part of the evolution theory. Our discussion is about the theory that Darwin claimed explains these observations. While counting these observations and coining the term natural selection was misleading for him, Darwin's novelty isn't true, and its truth is not new, yes. What's new in Darwin is not correct, and what's correct is not new. Therefore, brothers, it is wrong to say that Darwin's theory had mistakes. But Darwin's theory is essentially a collection of errors, myths debunked by reason and science, logical fallacies, and ridiculous fantasies to conclude that perfection and precision exist in beings. It doesn't require intention, will, or knowledge. A reminder, brothers, that our sessions are systematic ones for aligning the compass. Another methodological rule we learned today is that falsehood can only stand on falsehood and cannot be based on correct knowledge or sound reasoning. And wherever you apply this rule, you will find it applicable. We saw an example of it today with the myth of Darwin that beings came by chance. Some will wonder. However, weren't gaps in the theory closed after Darwin and its mistakes corrected? What is your response to the evidence from fossils, molecular biology, embryology, and vestigial organs? Can't the theory be reconciled with the existence of God? If it's a myth, as you say, why do Western scientists mostly believe in it? We will answer, brothers, systematically, God willing. We'll start with the claim of filling gaps and correcting mistakes, which will be the subject of our upcoming important episodes. So stay tuned, and may success be with God alone. Peace be upon you and God's mercy.